Hello, and welcome to Such a Nightmare, Conversations About Horror. My name is Katherine, and I'm delighted to be joined by Toni Tresca.
Hey there!
This is our Eerie Extras, which is essentially the place where we put all the stuff that we want to do but just doesn't fit elsewhere. And this is often where we do our sort of immediate response. We just saw it in theater and we're so excited to talk about it. Toni, what are we talking about today?
We are going to be talking about 2022's Scream.
Yeah, this is very exciting. So I want to begin by sharing that I've seen all of them. I've seen all of them several times over, but we decided to do something a little bit different because you've only seen the first one.
I've only seen the original, the original Scream. Yeah, I've seen it. I've seen it a couple times, and I love it. And so I don't know. I just hadn't gotten around to the rest of the Scream, and I'm excited for. I know when we inevitably for this podcast will be ripping in and stabbing our way through the rest of the Scream franchise. But yeah, no, before seeing this new Scream, the only one of the rest of the franchise that I had any exposure to was the first one.
And I didn't know, I was a little worried for you because I didn't know if they were going to do some sort of like montage of, you know, the killers throughout the times because, you know, one of the things that Scream tries to do is to surprise us with who's going to be the killer. I don't think it's ever been quite as effective as with Billy and Stu. But surprisingly / unsurprisingly, as we get through the monologue about what a requel is, they're not really interested in 2, 3, and 4, right? This is a reboot sequel to the first film that has maybe just a passing nod to the fact that there have been other films.
And the only thing that I was a little bit confused of with this new one, and I guess this is a brief spoiler for the second, third, and fourth one, maybe, although I'm not 100% sure. I haven't seen the second, third, or fourth one, is the referencing to the Stab franchise. I knew that the Scream movies got more meta, and they made a version of themselves within the franchise, because I had just, like, I mean, that's not an uncommon trope for even Wes Craven himself. He's done that before with New Nightmare. So I had heard about that within the Scream, and they referenced that within this one. But other than that, I didn't really feel like by not having seen the other Scream movies, I was missing out with this one.
And honestly, it's not even a spoiler because it's the first 5 minutes of Scream 2. Right, they're seeing Stab in the first 5 minutes, so there's really very little that's ruined or spoiled, which is again fitting for that term, which I rather like. I didn't think I would, but the requel, right? Because the idea is that you need to have seen the first one, you need to have loved the first one, but beyond that, you are not going to be affected one way or the other by your affection or lack thereof, right? Because I think it's often lack thereof for the rest of the films in the franchise. So let's talk about this film. What were your thoughts?
So ultimately, overall, I think I was underwhelmed by the film as a whole. I thought throughout there were some really, really strong moments, and I thought that there were some really good ideas that it introduced, but overall, I think I had some real problems with it, because it felt like a very, very different type of Scream movie, and a different type of horror movie than the first Scream. Like, this is much, much more clearly affirmative horror in a way that the original Scream is just not. And that is, we've talked about this before, it's a personal taste. I know that I'm not as big of a fan on affirmative horror, so when I realized that this new Scream was going to be a bit more like that, I realized, okay, maybe this one is not necessarily going to be my favorite.
I read something on Twitter that I felt summed up my feelings, and it was like, did I like the new Scream? Yes. And then I was like, was it my favorite Scream, and did I love it? No. Will I still be willing to watch it again and eventually own it? Yes. And I think for me, you know, one of the things this film did well is that they truly understood why and how a requel gets made, right? So I think about the 2010 version of Nightmare on Elm Street, where they're like, screw you fans, screw you people who love this film, this is what we're doing instead. And that was very alienating, whereas Scream was like, thank you so much for 25 years, which is just astonishing to me, for 25 years loving this franchise so much that we were able to bring back the big characters, that they were willing to come back, right? And I appreciated that. I appreciated the fact that this was truly a love song, but in a way that made sense in a lot of respects, with some really important problems that we'll eventually get to.
Yeah, and this film really does, I think, have, to speak to what you're saying, have its moments. Like, I really enjoyed the opening scene a lot. If I think that opening scene is where the film works the best, which is a positive, and I know now that I've just said that, also a negative, because that's the high point of the film, that opening scene. But I thought that the commentary that they were doing in that scene of, and I thought that, and what they were setting up of this idea of old classic slashers and 90s, the view of slashers, versus our more cerebral, modern understanding of what horror is, and this divide between the horror community, between older horror fans and younger horror fans. And I really liked a lot of that stuff in there.
That scene where she was like, my favorite movies are, and then she just listed all the A24 films.
Yeah.
And it was like, yes, you are that audience, right? You are that today's audience. And that conversation where he was like, I don't know, I find those rather dry and boring and lacking in jump scares. And you're so right that conversation, and this is what Scream has always done well, right? The franchises, is that the people that are making these films love horror so much that they're pretty much just like, remember that conversation we had last week? Let's put it into our script, shall we? Because that's what that scene bred as. And you know, it dated people who remembered the original, right? She was like, I don't know, that was so long ago. Do you mean the old film? And I was like, dear heavens. But at the same time, you know, it was clear that we were supposed to like be able to be in both positions, right? Both the sort of artsy horror, but also the like, but just kill someone already. And I think you're right that opening scene, which was doing so much of what makes an homage effective, really worked rather masterfully. I liked the end too. Obviously, we're spoiling things because that's what we do on the show.
That's what we do.
I thought that final scene where Sam killed Richie was beautifully shot, because it was very like erotically shot, you know. I mean, she was like the blood splattered, she was straddling him, the blood's doing whatever, and then and I liked that final sequence because I liked the emphasis on the final girls. This is the first film that has explicitly acknowledged what we've known all along, and that is that Gail Weathers is also a final girl. You know,
that is interesting. They don't. None of the other 3 or 4. She doesn't get her like final girl.
She
moment.
doesn't. She does in the same way she does in Scream 1, in the first Scream, where she gets it by being a survivor, by helping to end things, by being there in those final moments. You know, gun smoking with Sydney, but this film literally, as well as figuratively, framed them together a little bit more. And I liked the idea of Sydney being like, you ready to go kill him? And Gail was like, yep. And that discussion of like what the final girl has to be and what the final woman has to be, which is something we've been talking about a lot with our discussion of Grady Hendrix and Stephen Graham Jones. I appreciated that this film was aware of where the final woman needs to be now.
Yeah, I think I agree. I liked the final scene as well. I think that all the moments that you're talking about in particular really work. The pair, the Courtney Cox, Neve Campbell, and then the new addition to this film's final girl, Melissa Barrera, she's a good addition. I think of all of the new actors to it. She probably does the best job, I thought, of the new characters who got brought in.
I actually really liked the sister.
Jenna Ortega. She's I also liked her as well.
I think I liked her performance a little bit more, but maybe because I think that Sam was a harder character to pull off. because they were putting a little bit more, they were putting a lot in there for her to have to, like, act on with not really ultimately a ton of dialogue.
Yeah, I think Tara got a lot more, the sister, got the stronger scenes, and the writing was stronger for her character, because she got the opening scene, she got some really good scenes in the hospital, and then, of course, she gets the final scene in the house. She gets a lot of really good stuff to do, and she gets that amazing line at the end where she kills her friend Amber, and she's like, "I still prefer the Babadook."
Yes. Yeah, I thought that was a nice, like, way to sort of wrap it up. Okay, so I want to say one other thing that I liked, which is super tiny, and then I want to go back to the thing you mentioned about the hospital, because that's the beginning of where I really have some problems. Okay, so it was super tiny, but I did appreciate that they had that 4 West sign up at the party, right? I mean, they purposely named that character Wes so they could explicitly do that, but it was just nice. It was nice, again, to have that recognition that this is a film that is not trying to say, but I bet we could do better. It's like, we no longer get to have your Scream, so all we can do is try to give you our version of that, right? Our fan take of what you've given us. And so it was tiny, not a big thing, but it spoke to that, again, that sort of larger respect for the franchise and for the filmmakers. I think I like this film most when, and this is going to maybe sound contradictory to a lot of the larger things about the Scream, the first one, and I imagine maybe for fans of the rest of the franchises, I actually think this film worked best when it was being sentimental and actually earnestly taking the characters very seriously, particularly, I think, its handling of a lot of the legacy characters. I thought that the sentimentality and the seriousness and the fact that you really are supposed to feel really just heartbroken at where a lot of these characters are and how they've ended up. And then, of course, the explicit acknowledgement of the contribution that someone like Wes Craven made to the horror genre, to these filmmakers, and just the world and the horror community around. I thought that, and normally sentimentality, particularly within horror and horror comedies, does not really work for me, because I'm like, it just feels like a little too cheesy, or like they're forcing it. But I thought that the sentimentality in this actually was one of the film's better elements. However, I think it does contradict some of the themes within the film, which we can talk about now, because it's one of my it's the thing I think works best. Yeah, but I think that it doesn't necessarily work. Dewey was really, when she's like, "Why didn't you tell me?" And he's like, "Because I didn't want to be a failure," right? And she's like, "No, you just belong here." Like, I mean, that it was what, 2.5 minutes, but you know, it was a phenomenally acted scene, and you're right, it really showed us again that these are the characters we've loved for 25 years. And so let's talk about, you know, the death of Dewey, right? Because it's the hospital scene, and the death scene was fantastic. The stabbing him and ripping him from, you know, whatever the phrase is that Stu uses in the first one, right? Where we get to see them rip. And then, you know, the killer says, you know, "It's been an honor," or something like that. I thought the killing scene, that was fine. Here was one of my problems, though, and here's where things at various moments unraveled for me. It just wasn't realistic that hospital would have been empty. Like, it just, that didn't, you know, and like, let's set aside the fact that if Tara had major surgery, which she had, she wouldn't have her earrings in. Let's just set aside that tiny little issue of mine. Let's talk about the fact that it makes no sense, none at all, that hospital would have been completely empty. And I'm bothered by that, because one of the best parts about the Scream franchise is that he's in the midst of all these people. A lot of the kills in 2, 3, and 4 happen in the midst of tons of people, and that is the scariest thing, is it's not just when you're alone that you need to be afraid. You need to be afraid all the time. And I thought that was really frustrating, but also stupid, and also a missed opportunity. Right, because what would have been nice if, they were doing this homage thing, was if they turned it into a sort of Nightmare on Elm Street nightmare-esque sequence, right, where she, like, we quickly realize again that she's in some sort of dreamscape. Not that Ghostface Killer has the ability to get in there, but, you know, we just get to kind of have another, like, "Oh yeah, we bet you're also a fan of this franchise, but let's remember, in no world is a hospital empty." Ever. So I had a problem with it because it just felt sloppy in a way that that I know they can do better because they did so much better at so many other points in this film, but certainly in the franchise.
Yeah, that was certainly a weird moment. And again, the sequence works fairly well with that, with
her
what they're
having
able
to like
accomplish.
claw her way, you know, and she can't wheel herself because her hand is stabbed and she can't move. It was excruciating. It was actually fantastic, but it made no sense to set it there like that.
Yeah, and it's just a weird moment like that when a film that is so meta and aware of itself that it would be like,
and so explicitly and in terms of meta, making it clear like, hey, modern horror is very realistic, right? You're not going to have the unrealistic things of slashers and they're like, but we're going to take you into a hospital where there's only one person. So it felt very contradictory to what they were clearly trying to do, and they're just better than that. And it may sound nitpicky, but it becomes like a bigger sort of epidemic in the film.
Mm-hmm. There's lots of little moments like that don't entirely make cohesive sense. Another thing about the film that I think really suffers in comparison, particularly when you're viewing it to something like the original Scream, or even honestly the slashers of then, is I feel that a lot of the new characters whom they introduce are just not very interesting or really worthy of like the being a part of this Scream franchise. Like, one of the great things about the original Scream that I love so much is every single character in that movie is so unique and specific, and any one of them could be the killer, not because they're vague, but just because they're so specific and they all have a really clear motive and they bring in a very specific character type and baggage. In this movie, it didn't necessarily feel like they were really characters so much as like beginnings of an idea of a stereotype around what a kind of a person is, which again is just a little bit of a difference from the original, but it was enough that I was like, I don't really care about these characters, honestly. Yeah. And true, it's this, and again, this film does the same thing as the original in that, yeah, all of the characters are set up to where they could all be the killer, but you don't really care. Not in the same way that the original, where you're like, oh, any of these people could be the killer. And this one, you're like, well, yeah, I guess any of them technically could have done it because they don't give us very much information about any of these characters, and they don't really set them up outside of the fact that they could be the killer. Which is just a weekness, I think, of getting us to buy the characters in the world.
I like the way that you described it of the idea of a character, right? Because they clearly were like, let's not just have the super traditional X character, right? So our jockish character is also sensitive, and he's like, hey, I think you've been drinking too much, you know, and he's not a jerk, and you know, he's a twin. And so there's these little things that they're trying to do, right, to make us feel like these characters could be developed. But I think you're right. What happens when you have this many characters is that you just can't develop them all, because you need to return the legacy characters, and you need to make us feel like they're not just cameos, but they're developed characters in their own right. And then, you know, we have Sam and Tara that are going to need to be fully developed. And then by the time we get to, you know, the killers, so we have Richie and Amber, they need to be developed, but then the other ones need to be. You're right. And so it just becomes too much for a film to be able to do. Maybe a TV show, but we've tried that with Scream and to varying degrees of success. So, you know, but you're right. I think if you have that many characters, if you're trying to introduce that much stuff, something's going to give. And one of the results is the character development. I do think, though, that my biggest issue, and I'm surprised you haven't used this word yet, is that it's missing the camp. Right? So I don't think that this is a horror comedy. It's a horror film that has some moments of levity, and it's and I'm not sure I'm entirely, so I was having a conversation about this after we watched the film yesterday, and I'm not entirely sure I'm completely against the tone of this film, because the film says very explicitly the tone of horror today is different, and what audiences want is different, and so we're going to give them that. But at the same time, part of the magic and beauty of Scream is that it's a horror comedy, and it's a campy horror comedy. And this film tried that, especially in that opening sequence, I think successfully. But if you're not gonna go horror comedy, then you can't go affirmative.
Yes, okay. Yeah, I agree, because this film is just like a lazy affirmative horror with a little bit of meta commentary, rather than I think what I love the way that you've just described it, because I think that is the ultimate, the biggest thing holding this film back for me from like joining the ranks of Scream or even any of the other Craven films, is just that at the end of and I think it comes from rather than I think any of the performances, I think it's coming from the writing and the directing. Not to place too much of a blame on like an emphasis on the fact that Craven's creative control really did help shape and define it, but I think you really do feel that, and I think that maybe they knew that they couldn't possibly do that, and so they decided to just do this instead. But I think that's a weird. Not with the Scream franchise.
Yeah.
I think that there are just, within this movie itself, I thought it introduced a lot of ideas for what the film could have done instead, which is go ahead. No,
yeah.
go ahead.
So I think you're right that we have to admit that we don't have Wes Craven, we don't have Kevin Williamson, who not only gave us the first 4 Screams but gave us Dawson's Creek. So I mean, he's a fantastic writer. Craven was Craven. But I think you're right that what this film gave itself as the challenge was, how can we reinvent the horror film Scream, or maybe even they said the meta horror film Scream for today's audience, when maybe the question they should have asked themselves instead was, how do we adapt the meta horror comedy Scream? Because I think that's where we need to go next, right? I think we've acknowledged that we have shifted how we think about horror, but we're not quite there in terms of horror comedy. We're still relying on a lot of the things that we've been doing since the 90s, and that works in some respects, but it's time to go that next step, and I don't think we've done a very effective job yet, outside of maybe Get Out, but that's so
I think that's right. I think that's right, though. And I thought that was what this... After the opening scene, I honestly thought that this movie was going to be... Instead of just... that opening scene, I was like, oh, it's going to be this 90s style of slasher here, but then the rest of the film is going to be kind of how is this new killer evolving for a modern horror audience? And so I was hoping that the kills would be more cerebral, and we would get more elements more akin to Get Out or Hereditary within this film, and it was using those films as its framework to set things up and commentate on. But instead, I think ultimately it is still pulling from... It's making a lot of its references and jokes based on 80s and 90s horror, and just name-dropping 2000 and 2010's horror, rather than actually doing things with the new genre elements, the new tropes, and the new sort of style of horror that horror has come into. Yeah.
And there would have been some ways, I think, to really intriguingly play with that. So one of the scenes that comes to mind that is one of my favorite parts of Scream is when the Randy, who's being played by Jamie Kennedy, right, is saying, Jamie, look at behind you, right? And we're watching it on a screen, watching him watch it on a screen and all that stuff. So we get that scene in here where the female twin is watching that scene. And first off, that idea of cathartically watching your uncle get killed, or is that would have been really interesting to develop a little bit more. But it would have been perhaps more clever if, instead of the killer coming up behind her and she looks at the last moment, if she had been maybe recording herself, and so she could see behind her, and she's like, come on, so and so, and she's not looking in front of her, right? So so that...
Or I thought maybe another way to do it is just, instead of to add another element of modern on top of this old, is rather than having her watch it on a TV, why can't she be watching it on her phone? And then on the back of the phone, in the reflection, she's able to see the reflection of Ghostface, because then you'd have a character.
Right.
Then it's so meta. It's a
or if she's
character
watching
a thing on a... Yeah.
If she's watching it on her phone, while also recording her reaction to watching it, right? Then she would have been so focused. I mean, there would have just been some ways to really play with it. And I think that they tried, but sometimes got sort of lost in there. And I felt that there was no place that was more apparent than in our killers.
Yeah. Yeah, the killers really got, I think, the short end of the straw, and I think their motivation ultimately is so counterintuitive to the rest of the film, because so much of this film has been like, horror fans, we love them. This is a serious community that we're lucky to be a part of and have each other here. We love and respect and honor these characters, and you should too. That's why we brought them back. That's why we brought back all this legacy characters, because this is clearly so important to everybody. And then the villains are like, the ultimate theme is then contradictory there, where they're like saying, you shouldn't take this stuff too seriously. If you get too invested in horror, then you'll go crazy, and the fans are really the problem. So the film itself is trying to deliver and be this kind of fan service thing, and deliver satisfying and commit to taking horror very seriously and sentimentally. But then the villains themselves are saying, no, you can't do that. That's actually the worst thing you could do. And so then you kind of, in the third act, have this collision between two types of themes that don't cohesively go together.
Yeah, it was very problematic for several reasons. And there was this weird acknowledgement of that, right, where Richie says, like, I know, it's too bad that it's me, but it's best for the film. And I actually had less problem with Richie. I found Amber to be... First off, it was like, she's the killer. I don't know that it wasn't very tricksy, in my opinion. But I think my problem, I think you articulated it perfectly, and that is that they sort of fell back on who we would expect to be the killers. And I didn't want it to be the legacy characters, right? That would have absolutely ruined it. But if we kind of go back to that idea of, you know, if you're going to go more realistic, or if you're going to go more 2020s horror, then you have to give us a killer that makes sense in there, and it has to be something that feels a little bit less trite. So I wanted it to be 3 killers, because we haven't had one of those yet, and I wanted it to be Judy, who you will meet in Scream 4. I wanted it to be Judy, who in Scream 4, it's not giving really anything away, she has this moment where she talks to Sydney and she says, do you remember me? And Sydney's like, I'm sorry, I don't. She's like, oh, I went to high school with you, but I was a few years behind you. So I wanted it to be Judy. I wanted Judy to also have had a child from Billy, because I wanted Billy to be a little bit prolific in his seed spreading. And then I still wanted it to be... I was still okay with the idea of it being a boyfriend, but I wanted it to be 3, and I wanted it to be a commentary on having been at the margins of the last 25 years. So I wanted us to see, like, through some superimposition editing, that Judy had been in all of those places, and she was kind of upset that she hadn't had a chance to be not Sydney, but that she hadn't been even recognized for having been there all along. And if they had done that, it would have also paid homage to all of the types of killers we've had in 2, 3, 4, and all of their motives, which I'm trying not to spoil too much here for you. But it would have given us all of them, so that our 3 killers, would have covered every type of killer we had in Scream 1 through 4. And I have more that I would add on to that once you've seen 2, 3, and 4, we can talk about that more. But they missed the mark on what is arguably, for the franchise, one of the most significant components.
And, well, they missed the mark with this one, but they might be coming back and doing a couple more Screams.
I'd be okay with that.
Neve Campbell and the producers of this film have already started talking about how they're interested in doing some more. And I agree. I think that the Scream franchise is very important. I love it. And so I would be super down to continue seeing it. I think I'd rather maybe see... I don't want them to continue in this affirmative horror direction with the franchise. I think they've got to bring it back to being go back to the problems are in our world. They're in society. We can do a bit more of that disaffirmative horror. And honestly, I think I would actually like to see in the next one, maybe them develop on this idea of doing Scream in the style of more of a modern horror film, whatever that means to the next people who get to do a crack at this film. Because as much as I'd love it if it was us, I don't think they're gonna give us the
chances are that's not gonna happen. And I have to say, for all of my criticisms of this film, I was thinking about it. Scream 1 is still first because it may be / is a perfect film. Then I like Scream 2. And I'm not sure what your thoughts will be on it. But then it's this one. And then it's Scream 4. And then it's Scream 3, which is the saddest of the films for me. So, this film is still really high for me. It still did so much. And I will always be grateful that they were so respectful to those of us that have spent, in some version, our entire lives or 25 years, right? Just being like, this is where we want to be. So we will, of course, follow up on any of the other Screams that may make their emergence. We are working our way through the Scream franchise on our regular podcast episodes, so we hope that you check that out, and we'll probably come back to Scream 5 and sort of rewatch it with some theory when we get there. Anthony, Toni, what else do they need to know from us?
Well, you can check us out on all of our social medias, which are listed in the description of this podcast. Also, feel free to get in contact with us either through our social medias, our Gmail, send us any questions, and then it would just be amazing if wherever you get your podcast from, you give us a rating.
Yes.
It helps get us out there, get us a little bit more exposure, and honestly, it'd just be like super cool. So maybe do that at the end of this.
Thank you for listening to our nightmares.
And have a spooktacular day.